Add critical language proficiency to your resume with language training at MEI. Through group classes or one-on-one instruction in Arabic, Persian, Hebrew, Turkish, and more will help you achieve fluency so that you and your resume stand apart from the crowd. Online and in-person classes begin March 27th. Visit mei.edu/education for a list of classes and tutoring options, or call us at 202-770-0344. From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Hello and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast on regional affairs and U.S. policy produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Matthew Czekaj, managing editor at MEI. This Friday, February 24th, marks 1 year since Russia launched this full-scale, unprovoked war against Ukraine. The resulting deaths and devastation have been profound, with estimates of many tens of thousands of Ukrainians killed, over 13 million refugees and internally displaced persons, and damage to the Ukrainian economy and physical infrastructure in the multiple hundreds of billions of dollars. Yet Ukraine remains unbowed and continues to fight back with Western support. Russia finds itself in an increasingly desperate quagmire, having already suffered perhaps as many as 200,000 casualties. It has been abandoned or rebuffed by many of what it considered its closest traditional allies and partners. As much as the war has been an acute shock to Europe and the former Soviet space, the conflict has also reverberated beyond, including across the Middle East and North Africa. How has preoccupation with its war in Ukraine affected Moscow's posture in the MENA region? How has Russian aggression in Ukraine redrawn Moscow's regional relationships? And as the Middle East increasingly becomes a key area of global great power competition, is Russia still a meaningful player there, politically, economically, militarily, and diplomatically? To answer these and related questions, I am joined this week by 5 MEI scholars who will speak with me about the course of the war, Russia's budding quasi-alliance with Iran, complicated relationships with Erdogan's Turkey, its military posture in Syria, and declining diplomatic weight in conflict resolution processes across the region. You can subscribe to Middle East Focus on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast providers. First up, I'm joined by Iulia-Sabina Joja, the Senior Fellow and Director of MEI's Frontier Europe Initiative. She also teaches courses on European security at Georgetown and George Washington Universities. Iulia, thank you for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me, Matt.
The Russo-Ukrainian war has continued to generate headlines for a year now, and the world has dealt with the conflict's implications in both profound and personal ways. But a lot has happened in these 12 months. To begin, I thought it would be useful if you could walk our listeners through the various stages this war has already gone through. And I don't mean strictly on the battlefield, but additionally its political and diplomatic course. How has the conflict evolved over the past year, and where is it headed?
Beyond the fact that this is the biggest conventional war since World War II on the European continent, it's also just looking back for 1 year, pretty spectacular in terms of how many phases it's already had and how many evolutions, like you were suggesting, on the battlefield, but beyond that, in the diplomatic area, in the economic arena, and other domains. We started off with a full scale invasion that the West had been, particularly Washington and London, had been warning about for weeks and months ahead of the war. This full scale invasion, as we now know, started from 3 directions, but pretty quickly, 2 of the 3 basically failed. And instead of what we now know was Moscow's plan to conquer and fully invade Ukraine and its capital in 3 days, Ukraine resisted and in the first few weeks won the Battle of Kyiv, and then throughout the next few months won back Kharkiv and Kherson. I was in Ukraine in June, so a few months after the Battle of Kiev had been won, when people in Ukraine were telling me we don't really have any certainty that we won't have a new attack from the north, from Belarus, onto the capital. And this is the logic in which Ukraine has had to operate over the past few months. Moscow has ever since, through the summer, fall, and now winter, through everything they had at taking territory, particularly in the east, inch by inch, and in the meantime, where it could, applied methods such as mass deportations, massacres, torture, and other war crimes. And this inch by inch is very telling of Russia's military education. That's what officers in Moscow have learned. That's how warfare is to be done based on the methods from World War II. And we've seen many parallels from the Russian side throughout this war to World War II. And then Moscow has a bit changed the tactic when it realized that it wasn't very successful in the attempts that it initially made, and tried to apply pressure through bombings of civilians and civilian infrastructure while threatening the West, escalating in the hope of eroding Western support, increasing fear in the West, and at the same time, nevertheless, maintaining strategic initiative, forcing the West and Ukraine to merely react and for the West to trickle in military aid for Ukraine that Ukraine has been begging for throughout this war, with ample hesitations, especially hesitations in terms of delivering heavy weapons, as we've seen over the last few months. And so at the same time, economically, the West has been trying to isolate Russia as much as possible. Europe, in a very fast and surprising way, has managed to decouple itself from Russian energy. And now, 1 year later, we're definitely in a better place than we were a year ago. But we're definitely not at the end of this war. And we're looking at a new Russian offensive. Actually, we're right now in the eve of this new Russian offensive based on continuous mobilization and training, and looking at a few very bloody months ahead. If you're asking me how this will evolve, it really depends very much on the West's aid. We know that time is on Russia's side, and they're playing for time, trying to drag this out as much as possible to be able to then make the West get tired and focus on something else, forget about Ukraine, while the West is still hesitating. And we know now that with the supremacy of Western military technology, this war could have been ended by now. And yet it looks like it's going to drag on for a long time.
What do you think the United States and European allies should be doing to help Ukraine that they aren't doing already?
A bit based on what I was saying earlier, I think we've seen unprecedented support from the Western side under US leadership when we're comparing the numbers in terms of military aid, financial aid, even humanitarian aid. Oftentimes, the United States has not even led, but has delivered much more than the Europeans. So, this is a conflict on the European grounds. But we also have to acknowledge the fact that, again, the West is reactive. We haven't seen President Biden yet dedicate a single big speech to Ukraine. And we haven't seen him or leaders in particularly Western Europe, unlike in Central and Eastern Europe and Ukraine's neighbors, formulate a clear vision and strategy for this war. We say we are committed to helping Ukraine as much as it needs. But if we're looking into the details, Ukraine has been, for instance, asking for fighter jets and for tanks since March 2022. And we've hesitated to give them these weapons. Oftentimes, it's been associated with patronizing tones, such as we already give them everything they need. And so now, as we're looking at this new or renewed Russian offensive, we know that Ukraine, for instance, has been asking for and needs a minimum of 300 tanks, but we've pledged very late, just over the last month, about 100 tanks, and none of them have yet arrived in Ukraine. And so this is why I'm saying we're looking at the next few months as being a very bloody battle with a lot of lost lives. And much of this could have been avoided if we would be a little bit more resolute. So again, the war will drag on for as long as the West is trickling in aid instead of showering Ukraine with aid.
Yeah, as you've alluded to and laid out, the war has created tectonic changes across the region. What has Russia's unprovoked attack on Ukraine done to Moscow's partnerships and alliances across the former Soviet space?
Yeah, I think there were a lot of elements that we didn't know about these partnerships and alliances across the former Soviet space, with the exception, of course, of Ukraine. I'm going to take Ukraine out of this. They weren't partners, at least since 2014 when Russia first invaded Ukraine. But if we're looking at other partnerships and alliances, we have something that has the ambition to be institutionally the equivalent of NATO. And the last few months have shown that it is not the CSTO, because when allies or partners of Russia have been in need of military aid over the last year, Russia did not have the political will or the resources to help, and that has diminished its leadership or really its partnerships one by one. A telling example in terms of this reduction of Russian credibility has been, I believe it was in September 2022, when the leadership of Kyrgyzstan so called humiliated Putin by letting him wait for a meeting, something that we wouldn't have been able to see or imagine a year or two ago. And so Russia's role in the former Soviet space is diminished. Its alliances are diminished. Maybe the biggest exception to that would be Belarus, right? Russia has managed to drag Belarus effectively into this conflict, launching its initial full scale invasion in February 24th, 2022, including from the Belarus territory. And there's been a lot of rumors, and this would be overlapping with Moscow's interest to actually also have Belarusian soldiers intervene on Ukrainian ground. That hasn't happened. And I think this is a good example of the countries in the former Soviet space have been trying to keep themselves out of this conflict as much as possible. Some were able to do that more than others, depending on how vulnerable they are. On the other end of the spectrum is a little bit further south, Moldova, that over the last 20, 30 years was small country, very vulnerable, has underinvested into its security and has sort of hesitated between its western orientation and its eastern orientation. This summer, in the context of the war in Ukraine, Moldova achieved EU candidate status, which is a really important step for them. But that doesn't mean that they are out of the threat zone, because just over the last few days, the Moldovan president came out to reveal, based on Ukrainian actually intelligence, how Russia has been trying to organize a coup to remove the pro-Western government from Chisinau, the capital of Moldova. So these are just some examples to illustrate the fact that Russia's military might and power overall is diminishing in the region because they're consuming the majority of their resources on Ukraine with limited success, but it's still a mixed picture depending on what country we're focusing on.
What personally brought this war home to billions, especially outside of Europe, was the sharp rise in food prices caused by Russia's blockade of Ukrainian grain exports. In July of last year, President Erdogan of Turkey helped negotiate a deal that obligated Russia to permit the resumption of grain shipments from Ukraine's Black Sea ports. That deal was extended last autumn, but it is up for renewal again next month, and Russia is already trying to put pressure on all sides to drop sanctions in return for Moscow to continue to play ball. How do you see the issue of food security shaping up this year, and what should the MENA countries that rely on grain supplies and fertilizer from the Black Sea expect?
They should do the reverse. They should themselves put increasing pressure on Russia. Ukrainian agriculture remains vital, and currently it remains largely controlled and often destroyed, as we've seen in several instances from last summer, by Russia. It's also important to note that only 20 million tons out of the overall capacity of Ukraine to export agricultural products have been promised to be shipped through this grain deal with the help of Turkey through the Bosphorus. But numbers so far show that about half of that has been shipped, and instead we get increasing reports that Ukrainian or other vessels that are shipping, transporting Ukrainian agricultural products are unnecessarily held for days and days in around the straits and not being able to cross to be able to export to countries such as in the Middle East. And so that has meant that, for instance, Romania next door has been taking on exporting 12 million tons of Ukrainian agricultural products, but that adds artificially to the price through additional rail and road transport and through transit fees. So the danger of Russia amplifying the crisis in time for next summer, being again responsible for hunger in places such as in the Middle East and beyond, are high. And the only thing to keep prices low and exports high from Ukraine is to just increase international pressure on Moscow so that we can continue to receive Ukrainian agricultural products.
Iulia-Sabina Joja, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Next, I'm joined by Alex Vatanka, the director of MEI's Iran program and a senior fellow with the Frontier Europe Initiative. Alex, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me, Matthew.
One of the most transformative developments we've seen in the region over the past year has been the progressive tightening of the Russian-Iranian relationship across multiple spheres: military, economic, energy, and political. What have been the main drivers that have led to the current situation?
As you said, Matthew, it looks like a grand strategic partnership, and in many ways it is, and yet it isn't either at the same time. And let me explain what I mean by that. When I look at Iranian Russian relations, and certainly this latest phase where we can describe it as one of deepening of relations, I still don't see much of an ideological affinity between the two systems that are in power in Tehran and in Moscow. They're very different political models, as we know. There is no real good economic fit. These are two large energy export dependent economies. By and large, Iran and Russia happen to be holding some of the largest natural gas and oil reserves in the world. So, in that sense, they're more rivals for markets, and we certainly see that happening as we speak. I would even argue there is no real close historic proximity between the two. I mean, they've been rivals going back centuries. Persia lost plenty of territories in the Caucasus and Central Asia in the last couple of centuries to the Russians. And the Soviets weren't always that friendly to Iran either. So what's then left? What keeps this relationship together? And to me, the answer is very simple, and it's the common position that they have in Tehran and Moscow jointly against the United States and the West. So this anti-American platform is really, I think, the glue that keeps it together. Now, we have obviously seen the last few years a turn for tighter relations. But I would argue that Iran's Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei would have wanted those tighter relations years ago. It was Vladimir Putin and the Russians that, for their own reasons, kept their distance to Iran. But then the war that Russia began in Ukraine last year left Moscow with few options. And it was no perhaps surprise that the first country that Putin visited last year after the invasion of Ukraine was Iran, again, pointing to the necessity. I could go on, but Matthew, let me just recap quickly. I think there are a couple of reasons that this relationship is moving in the direction of becoming a closer one. Anti-Americanism, the fact that both Russia and Iran are deeply sanctioned countries, have practical reasons to want to work with one another to go around Western sanctions. They all make sense, but we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that there are plenty of reasons why this relationship cannot ultimately become a very close strategic one in the long term, because there are so many factors that would go against that.
Alex, you said recently that Iran has the weakest foreign policy establishment since 1979. And what did you mean by that? And do you think that this has influenced the level of engagement that Iran's leadership has been willing to pursue?
By that, I mean, if you look at the president, Ibrahim Raisi, he has, to be very blunt, he's the weakest president in this Islamic Republic since 1979. All presidents in this Iranian system play a second fiddle to the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, who's been there since 1989. But by and large, presidents also have a bit of space to sort of put their mark on things and stand up for a certain agenda that they can, claim to be theirs. That's not the case with Ibrahim Raisi. He doesn't stand for anything. So he doesn't have anything really to say different than Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader, when it comes to foreign policy. And if you look at the Iranian foreign minister, Hossein Amir Abdullahian, he is someone who comes from the ranks of the Revolutionary Guards. He's not someone who has anything different to say than the men in uniform, which are essentially the ones who are running Iran's foreign policy on key issues today, including the Russians. So, you could say a few years ago, someone like Hassan Rouhani and his foreign minister, Javad Zarif, might have picked up a fight against the Revolutionary Guards. And we certainly see plenty of evidence of that on key issues like Iran's role in Syria and so on. That's not happening anymore. The so-called moderate faction or the pragmatic faction in the regime don't have anything to contribute at the moment. They're sidelined, which means that the Revolutionary Guards generals will be in the driver's seat, and they look at Russia as an insurance policy. They look at Putin as someone who will deliver for them against the West, protecting Iran at places like UN Security Council, at International Atomic Energy Agency, so on. Maybe they hope for some military-to-military ties, and some of that obviously is happening, but I'm talking about more sophisticated Russian equipment going to Iran at some point in the future. Right now, there's only talk of that. So the military in Iran is the reason why, and I should clarify that. By military, I mean the Revolutionary Guards in Iran are the ones who are really shaping Iran's most sensitive foreign policy files. The foreign ministry is not able to, resist that. And that in many ways explains so much why Iran has gone in this direction of closer military relations with Putin's Russia.
So are you actually arguing that Supreme Leader Khamenei is too weak to stand up to the IRGC on this issue? Or has he never really been as involved in foreign policy as we would think?
He has very much been a number one voice when it comes to key foreign policy issues since he became Supreme Leader back in June 1989. What is happening is that there isn't much of a daylight between the worldview of Ali Khamenei and the generals in the Revolutionary Guards. They combined came up with the idea of the so-called doctrine of look east in Iran's foreign policy, which basically means, in a nutshell, forget the West. The West is a declining power. The United States and the Europeans are not going to be as important in years to come as countries like China and to some extent Russia. So they have made a decision, very much a political decision, and based on what they need to happen domestically at home in terms of hanging on to maximum power. They don't want to open the door to relations with the West because they believe the West is after either empowering the so-called pragmatic moderate forces in Tehran, which obviously Khamenei and the Guards do not want to see, or that the West is going to essentially look for ways to topple the Islamic Republic. And that sort of scenario in their minds leaves them with one option, which is to bank on Russia and China. Now, it has been a strategy that has produced plenty of disappointments for them. So, for example, the Chinese are not investing in Iran, and nor are the Russians. I mean, just this week, we've seen some leaked information come out that talks about Russian reluctance to invest in Iran's energy sector. So Khamenei is very much the reason, and his partnership and the fact that he has the same view as the Revolutionary Guards is the reason why Russia is able to play such a dominant position in terms of Iran's foreign policy behavior. And the foreign ministry, as I described before, is just not in a position to at all resist this push.
You've also argued that Iran sees Russia's position to be waning in the neighboring South Caucasus. How much has the past year exacerbated such perceptions for Tehran, and what implications has that had for Iranian activities in the region or local tensions with Russia?
The war of 2020, when Azerbaijan, with Turkish and Israeli support, was able to regain Azeri territories that had been lost to Armenian forces. This was a surprise to the Iranians. They didn't see it coming. They had for so long expected Russia to be kind of the power that would keep the status quo in the South Caucasus. And that status quo had been there for some 30 years. It worked from Iran's position. And suddenly that was upended, which meant that the Iranians have and are still busy to figure out what to do next, because they no longer can assume that Russia will be able to maintain the sort of political or geopolitical realities of the South Caucasus, as has been the case in the past. And from Iran's point of view, an increase in Turkish and Israeli power in the South Caucasus, principally in the country of Azerbaijan, is a net potentially threat to Iran's interest. And it's not just about geopolitics. Without getting into too much detail, the relations between the Republic of Azerbaijan and Iran are very complicated because of the close history and the fact that there are twice as many ethnic Azeris in Iran as they are in Azerbaijan, make it a very sensitive issue. What we've seen in recent months is an Iranian attempt to, if you will, shape Baku's calculations to let the Turks and the Israelis know that more presence on their part in Iran's northwest neighborhood will be met by an Iranian reaction. What that reaction will look like remains to be seen.
Do you see any possible cleavages that the US or even countries in the Middle East could use to try to weaken or undermine the Russian-Iranian relationship?
I mean, I think fundamentally what could shape how close Russia is willing to move in its relations with Iran is what other states in the Middle East and the Gulf states, to be very specific, can offer the Russian Federation. The reality is the Russians, as we've seen, are receiving Iranian drones. There's talk of Iranian ballistic missiles going to Russia. And all that, I'm sure, is helpful for Putin's military campaign in Ukraine. But the Russians need more, certainly in the longer term. Their economy, which is now the most sanctioned economy in the world, would surely need injections of cash. They would need to, as an oil and gas exporting country, need to perhaps coordinate price with other oil and gas exporting countries. And many of those happen to be in the Arab world, in the Gulf region, which means if Russia needs to find ways to collaborate, say, with countries like Saudi Arabia and UAE, they might in turn demand certain things from Moscow in terms of its relations with the Islamic Republic of Iran. In other words, they might ask the Russians to help shape Iranian decisions, particularly what they consider to be Iranian expansionist actions in the Middle East. So you could envisage a situation where the Gulf countries, in particular among Iran's neighbors, might have economic leverage over Russia. And in turn, that might result in a Russian desire then, or Russian interest to shape or contain Iran. Now, a lot of this will depend also separately on the relationship that the West will have on this issue with the Gulf countries. So, for example, if the United States can convince the Gulf states that they should not expand their economic relations with sanctioned Russia, then that really cancels out everything I just said. There won't be a cooperation between the Gulf states and Russia, and the Russians wouldn't have a motive to sort of contain Iran. So there are many factors here. I think fundamentally what we have not seen so far is a shift, a gigantic shift in terms of how Russia looks at the Middle East. For example, Iran happens to have Israel as its chief rival in the region. The Iranians, I'm sure, would love to see more of a distance between Russia and Israel. Hasn't happened. Moscow still has pretty much the good relations it has had with Israel for some time. That's just an example to show you that if you're sitting in Tehran and you think your closer ties with Russia will, essentially reshape how Russia is acting vis-a-vis the region, that hasn't happened. The Russians are trying to have the best set of relations with individual countries in the region, while obviously trying to stay out of the various conflicts that happen to exist among the states in the region.
Alex, thanks so much for speaking with me.
Thank you, Matthew. My pleasure.
Next up, we have Yörük Işık, a non-resident scholar with MEI's Turkish Studies program and a geopolitical analyst in Istanbul, where he runs the consultancy Bosphorus Observer. Thank you very much for joining me.
My pleasure, Matt.
First off, we are recording this less than 2 weeks since the deadly earthquake that struck southern Turkey. My sincere condolences go out to you and the Turkish people dealing with this tragedy.
Thank you. It's been definitely a most devastating effect, and which I think in the upcoming months, maybe even years, we will see the political and financial consequences of this terrible actually two earthquakes happening almost in 24 hours period of time. But we will see the effects in the upcoming months.
Diving into the subject we had agreed to discuss earlier, since Russia's re-invasion of Ukraine, the Russian-Turkish bilateral relationship has been among the most complicated and vexing in the region, if not more generally. It has continually veered from tense and antagonistic, such as over Turkey's closure of the straits and military technical support to Ukraine, to diplomatically friendly, with multiple summits between Erdogan and Putin, to occasionally constructive, such as Erdogan's role in helping secure the Ukrainian grain deal. But how would you characterize this relationship? And as the war grinds on and Erdogan faces political problems at home, where do you see the bilateral relationship going?
Yeah, it's been definitely some kind of dysfunctional, competitive friendship. We are almost at odds in every subject with Russia, but somehow the leaders, they need each other, and they both have problems with the international community. And Turkey and Russia are next door to each other, and they are amazing trade partners. The relation survives despite Turkey and Russia, as I said before, on every subject, not only in Ukraine, which Turkey, since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2014, has been on Ukraine's side more than any other, maybe Western European leaders. Time after time, President Erdogan and other state ministers repeated that any violation of Ukraine's territorial integrity is unacceptable to Turkey. But in Ukraine, in Caucasus, in the Balkans, in Africa, Turkey and Russia, they are in totally different positions. But because of energy, because of the domestic politics of both countries, the relation somehow survives all the bumps on the road. And in this relation, Turkey, sometime very roughly, sometime more diplomatic ways, it's trying to seize the moment to obtain small gains. And it looks like it's achieving some of this in this policy. It made small achievements into Russian territory and diplomatic territory, military territory in many different areas.
Yeah, you seem to be saying that the relationship is very personality driven. So if Erdogan happens to lose the election this year, do you see any likely major shift in Ankara's policy toward Moscow?
I will say if Erdogan loses the election, Turkish foreign policy won't change overnight, but it will stop being so personalized. This tendency existed all the time in all throughout the last 2 decades Erdogan has been in power. But the last 4 or 5 years, the Turkish foreign policy is fully personalized. So we will see in the immediate term the Turkey's foreign policy positions in every subject, in the Eastern Mediterranean, in the Middle East, in the Caucasus. Foreign policy positions are not changing, but it's becoming more institutionalized and becoming more sober-headed, more rational approaches. Because right now, sometimes we go from crisis to crisis because everything is so personalized.
As Russia's focus has concentrated on Ukraine, has this opened up areas for Turkey to be more assertive in its neighborhood or in more distant regions?
Definitely. I mean, the most recent example, obviously, it's in the Caucasus. The Russian failing military operation in Ukraine really exposed Russian weaknesses in many different geographies, but especially for Turkey and Azerbaijan, the biggest area is the Caucasus. And today, actually, this while we are recording this in the last 24 hours, Armenian foreign minister visited Turkey, and we are seeing sometimes it happens after natural disasters like this. In the 1999 earthquake, Turkey and Greece had a rapprochement, and it's then and have several years of very successful, productive relations. And now we are seeing the disaster diplomacy one more time with the Armenian FM visiting Turkey. And actually, just before the Ararat Mirzoyan's visit, Turkey was already looking ways to have an opening with Armenia, and Armenia's helping hand during this humanitarian crisis created a good cover. I'm sure, though, this approach is not in surprise to Baku. Turkey and Azerbaijan, they really are coordinated foreign policy, and they are seizing the moment when there's a good opportunity, and they already agreed during the Mirzoyan's visit that they're going to open the land border to the third country nationals. That even that is a small step. It's not going to be open to Armenians or Turkish people yet, but land borders, even limited opening after quarter century, it's a very big step. I think everyone in Ankara, in Baku, and Pashinyan in Yerevan, everyone realizes that in their own ways, the decline of Russian power in the Caucasus, and they are maneuvering to find a new equilibrium. And we see from Russia's reaction also, like Brussels makes some moves, But Brussels, I think, is its influence in the Caucasus is very limited. But Russia will try to definitely sabotage Ankara's attempts that, any kind of rapprochement between Baku and Yerevan, any kind of relation getting built, diplomatic relation, it works against Russia. The moment Armenia and Azerbaijan are talking to each other, it doesn't have to be in the most friendly way. That makes Russia less relevant, and it will end the Russian presence in the Caucasus. So we will see Russia trying to maneuver, and we see the Russian billionaires' sudden appearance in the Artsakh region, in the Karabakh region, etc. Russia will try to play some other games, trying to destabilize maybe the Armenian government to continue its presence there. The region the issues are not settled yet. We're going to see more drama created by Russia there for sure.
Returning to Turkey, after the devastating earthquake, international aid and support has been pouring in, obviously. But interestingly, reports suggest that Russia has sent its Emergency Situations Ministry to help with its relief efforts, which are being headed on the ground by Danil Martynov. Now, Martynov is a Chechen army colonel close to Chechnya's pro-Kremlin strongman Ramzan Kadyrov, and he is accused of committing war crimes in Ukraine. Turkey has long provided political sanctuary for Chechen refugees who left their homeland after the Chechen wars in the 1990s and the 2000s, and those who opposed the Kadyrov regime. But last year, the Chechen diaspora expressed alarm at news that Turkish intelligence was apparently meeting with Kadyrov. And now a Chechen war criminal close to Kadyrov is reportedly inside Turkey. How should we understand this situation, and what might it imply about Turkey's policy toward Russia and Chechnya?
I think the policies, again, are not changed. This is a classic Russian tactic. When they found an opportunity, they will try to insert their standing positions. And this is done fully to send a political message. It's like the situation when the grain crisis, before the grain deal was struck, that the entire world was discussing how the grain could be moved. And one of the proposals of the President Putin was, let's send it via Belarus. And Belarus is under sanctions. It cannot go from there. But they try to insert their positions when they find an opportunity like this. This was a moment. It's not a classy act. They know it. But it's just in a moment of help, Russia is try to politicize this situation. I think there is actually, besides these colorful examples, the real drama of Russian and Turkish relations, it's going to be in the trade issues that we see from the Commerce Secretary's visit to Ankara and other warnings given to Ankara by different partners. Like today, we learned that the German Exports Agency is not approving Siemens's parts to be exported for Rosatom's Akkuyu nuclear power plant construction in Turkey. In the same situation for the PAX, they are trying to build one in Hungary. And the Commerce Secretary is warning that Ankara should very carefully watch the chemicals and microchip exports from Turkey to Russia, because we see the trade is booming, and the trade is between Russia and Turkey tripled. It's many electronic parts in very daily white goods and unexpected white goods might have dual use, like a chip in a refrigerator on a smart TV could be used in a weapon. So Turkey is exporting these goods to Russia without any control and without any checks. Sometimes I can even say maybe without even understanding the seriousness of this subject by Turkish exporters. And also there is a really colorful drama is developing between Gazprom's gas exports to Turkey. Turkey is negotiating very hard, given that Turkey is one of the only remaining partners of Russia, not economic partners, or they still doing trade with Russia. Turkey is bargaining very hard to lower the price, and there is this Russian plan that building a gas hub, which is, again, it's exactly lost in translation moment. What Russians understand from gas hub and what Erdogan and Turkey and what Turks understand from gas hub are actually totally different. And about the pricing and where the gas is sold, in Russians' mind, the gas is sold in the Turkish-Bulgarian border, and in Turkey's mind, it's a big gas hub and it's gas exchange, and the gas comes to Turkey and it gets mixed here with the Turkish gas that's going to come from the Black Sea, and Turkey invited to join into the gas hub Iran, Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan. and Turkey is dealing to sell it to EU to position in Turkey in an important place. So all these issues, there is lots of lost in translation moments, and the real discussion, the real tension, besides the colorful events of this commander is coming to Turkey or who's patrolling where in Syria, actually the real struggle between Russia and Turkey happens in this commercial trade issues. And so far, because of Russia's self-defeating movements in Ukraine, Turkey has slight upper hand, but Turkey's domestic politics is going through such a extremely dysfunctional moment. And now on the top of all that, there is this huge earthquake with a massive financial, besides the amazing humanitarian side of it, tens of thousands of people are dead, but there is going to be an amazing economic bill from this. And so it's a very complex situation, and we'll see how all these things will resolve. And it's not going to be easy for, I think, neither parties, because both Russia and Turkey are really at this moment in history, both countries are going through very personalized and very dysfunctional moments. And these countries are not run in an institutionalized or a systematic way.
Well, you've given us plenty to think about, monitor, and observe. So, Yörük, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.
My next guest is Charles Lister, who heads the Syria as well as the Countering Terrorism and Extremism programs at MEI. Welcome to the program, Charles.
Hi, thanks for having me.
First off, how would you describe the nature of the Russian-Syrian relationship today, nearly 8 years since Russia intervened in the civil war on Bashar al-Assad's behalf?
I would say it is closer than it's ever been, or as close as it has been. I don't think we've seen any sort of necessarily marked difference. The one element of nuance I might insert here is, since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, whilst I don't think necessarily, and I'm sure we'll come on to speak about this, I don't think necessarily Russia's posture has changed dramatically. I do think diplomatically it has been somewhat more distracted by events in Ukraine and the immediate neighborhood. And as a result of that, I think we've seen less sort of direct Russian investment in terms of shaping the regime's posture within the international community. We've certainly seen less Russian encouragement of the regime's engagement in initiatives like the Constitutional Committee. I think in the wake of this recent earthquake, we've certainly had a much less vocal Russian role played in terms of defending the regime's position, in terms of calling for the removal of sanctions and what have you. So I think a lot of that can probably be explained away by distractions caused by the war in Ukraine. There may also be an element to which the regime also feels more comfortable now than it has done in a long time. And there's an extent to which now Moscow is more happy to sort of delegate public rhetoric, public positioning, public posture to Damascus, rather than having to essentially be its proxy within the international community as it has done in the past.
So actually following up what you just said there, do you think that Assad feels as beholden to the Kremlin today as he may have several years ago?
That's, I think, sort of the billion-dollar question today. I think there is an extent of sort of deeply ingrained arrogance within the regime, has more or less consistently failed to thank the likes of Russia and Iran for essentially saving its position, saving its status as ruler in Syria. And I think today more than ever, given the fact that any conversation about overthrowing the regime or encouraging the regime to essentially negotiate its own removal through a political settlement, those kind of conversations are long gone now. And I do think that has kind of empowered the regime and put it in a place where it is so self-confident that I don't think it is openly as willing to appear as reliant on Russia. I think it is clearly very well aware and cognizant of the importance of its relationship with the Russian government, but also makes much less of a deal of that in public than it used to. And as a sort of segue or a tangent here, it is also possible that given its apparent diplomatic distraction caused by the war in Ukraine, that has also, to an extent, encouraged the regime to diplomatically and more publicly position itself closely to the Iranian regime. And that has certainly been clear in the, I would say, 6 to 8 weeks before the earthquake. in particular, where we had a lot of conversations about the decline of the Syrian economy, in part due to some decisions made by Iran, but also the whole conversation around the prospects for a re-engagement or normalization between Turkey and the Syrian regime. And in that dynamic, it wasn't the Russians that were playing such a significant and consistent role, although they got things started. The role played by Iran in terms of inserting itself quite aggressively into that equation and forcing the regime to completely reverse its posture of interest in that track of engagement, I think was really noticeable. And you could potentially argue that that wouldn't have happened if the war in Ukraine wasn't such an ongoing distraction for Moscow.
Particularly when the war in Ukraine first started to go poorly for Russia in late February and early March of last year, some observers predicted that Moscow would try to redeploy some of its forces from Syria. But while we've seen some small-scale rotations, there hasn't really been a large downgrade in its military presence. What does the level of Russia's footprint in Russia or in Syria look like today? What are its capabilities and missions, and how has it changed over the past year?
Yes, there was a lot of initial reporting claiming that the Russians were conducting some dramatic withdrawal from Syria, that they were recruiting Syrians to go and fight in Ukraine. But really, we haven't seen a great deal of evidence to support almost any of that. We have certainly seen, as you say, rotations in and out. The one possible thing that may have changed is a reduction in the deployment of Wagner Group forces inside Syria. Now, more often than not, they were not playing a kind of frontline combat role. Their primary responsibility in Syria, at least openly so, was training various parts of the Syrian Arab army. It does appear to be the case that there has been a reduction in Wagner deployments, but I don't think that that has much of a dramatic impact in terms of any of the front lines that are frozen but still active. More broadly than that, though, and specifically to your question, we haven't really seen any significant change in terms of Russia's ability to exert itself in various areas of Syria. Hmeimim, the main airbase on the west coast, remains as active as it's ever been. There's been no marked reduction in air sorties, in the use of reconnaissance drones. There's been no significant change, no noticeable change in joint Russian-Turkish patrols in certain areas of northern Syria. So I don't think anything dramatic has shifted. And to be honest, most of that is because Russia was doing quite a lot in Syria with a relatively minimal footprint. That minimal footprint was never going to have a dramatic impact on Russia's ability to exert itself in Ukraine. And more often, Russia does still have that much broader strategic picture in mind. And Hmeimim Air Base still plays a very significant role for Russia in terms of being able to exert force far beyond Syria and, in fact, far beyond the Middle East and into Africa. And so, again, all the more reason for why Russia has no interest in downgrading and undermining its presence on Syrian soil.
That said, in the first weeks of the war, Turkey mostly closed the Bosporus and the Dardanelles to the Russian Navy, which affected the resupply of its contingent in Syria. Could you comment on how all this might have affected Russia's ability to project force in the Levant and Eastern Mediterranean?
I would more or less describe that step by the Turks as a complicating factor rather than an obstacle to resupply, to its lines of logistics. Turkey's decisions didn't prevent Russia from channeling military vessels through the Bosporus and the Dardanelles towards the Mediterranean and Syria. What it prevented was them returning to the Black Sea specifically. So you can make an argument that in theory and on paper, the Russians have had to, therefore, when they've returned those vessels to Russia, they have had to take much longer routes to get back. But I think, frankly speaking, the primary Russian sort of way around this, and this was always a loophole in that original Turkish sort of legislation and agreement, was that so long as Russia uses civilian-flagged vessels, there's nothing that the Turks can do to stop that, even if they're openly carrying or known to be carrying military equipment. So long as they are civilian-flagged vessels, that is a loophole through which the Russians are more than able and more than willing to jump through. And I think we've seen quite a lot of that. And so, yes, it may have complicated the Russian military's ability to resupply, but certainly not stopped it.
Charles Lister, thank you so much for a very rich discussion.
Thanks for having me.
My final guest, Dr. Roger Kangas, is the Dean of the Near East South Asia Center for Strategic Studies of the U.S. Department of Defense. He is also an adjunct professor at Georgetown University and an associate fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, IISS. Thank you for coming on to speak with me, Roger.
You're welcome. Happy to be here.
Diving right in, can you describe what Russia's broader approach has been to its diplomatic involvement in conflict resolution processes in the Middle East and North Africa? And do you think that involvement has on balance been positive or detrimental to those peace-building efforts?
These are excellent questions. And first, I should say, as an employee of the Near East South Asia Center, these are my views and not that of the U.S. Department of Defense, the U.S. government, or the NISA Center. And, what I would say is when we look at the Russian approach to the region, we have to first take a step back and realize what are their ultimate goals. Russia and the Putin leadership, the folks around him, believe that the world needs to be a multipolar construct with Russia as one of these poles. US needs to be diminished, NATO diminished. It is not the security organization of choice, et cetera. And so with this worldview, we can then say, well, Russia's immediate interests are its neighborhood, the near abroad, so to speak, using their language, relations with Europe. The rest of the world is situational, and this now gets to the Middle East and North Africa. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia was minimally engaged through the 90s and into the early 2000s. But then we saw a resurgence of Russian activity, not just Syria and Libya, but also diplomatic overtures in the region, engaging with OPEC as OPEC Plus. And so we see this investment and involvement on an economic level in military terms, not just active engagement, but also arms sales. And yes, there is this diplomatic element. Russia sees itself as being able to balance different parties, as being a country that does not have a colonial legacy in this space, so can come across as not just neutral, but positive. And I would argue through the invasion of Ukraine, found itself in an interesting situation where it was largely viewed in a positive or at least neutral term by countries in the region, rarely seen as a negative or in pejorative terms. And so when we think of its involvement, it sees itself as being positive. I personally would say that the results are a bit more mixed. And in fact, we see Russia as an opportunistic actor, but that's at least how they're framing themselves in the region.
Last year, Russia voted in the UN to label the Houthis a terrorist organization, and in Libya, Russia effectively ended its longtime support for Khalifa Haftar, pulled at least some of its mercenaries from the country, and agreed to reopen its embassy in Tripoli and open a consulate in Benghazi. Do these steps signal Russia's diplomatic exhaustion as it focuses on Ukraine, or do you think this is a change in Moscow's strategy of trying to insert itself on all sides of every conflict as the indispensable mediator?
In a strange way, I can say both. Clearly, Russian diplomatic security bandwidth is occupied with Ukraine. There's no question. Not just the leadership, but obviously key decision makers in Moscow. When we look at its involvement in other parts of the world, we see a pulling back, keeping things as status quo, not being as active or engaged. And so the two cases you provide, Yemen and Libya, wonderful examples of seeing this play out. With Yemen, I look at it as not just perhaps changing their stance on the Houthis, but also helping to deepen a relationship with Saudi Arabia and other actors in the region with which they want to continue to engage, long past any conflict in Ukraine. With Libya, I see this as a target of opportunity. Khalifa Haftar came close to perhaps being a key actor in the region. Obviously, the situation is much more complex. His role is diminished a bit. And so Russia is looking at perhaps playing a different role. And as you said, looking at all sides in this engagement. That strategy is actually something one sees applied elsewhere in the world. So it's fascinating to see both an opportunistic approach, but then also back to the original point, the fact that Ukraine is taking up a fair amount of Russian attention.
On Syria, Russia had previously introduced a rival Astana process to coordinate resolving the Syrian civil war and to rebuild the country. But how successful has this format been, and what is its future?
My personal opinion, I think the process has failed. The Astana process was an attempt to bring in other actors. No surprise, the US, European Union countries, the UK are absent. And so the hope was to reframe the future of Syria using other countries in this effort. To some extent, the immediate objective of regime survival or regime continuity with the Assad government has happened. People aren't looking at post Assad Syria in as much of the same light as, say, several years ago. For Russia, this is seen as a victory. Consolidation of power in much of the country, although very clear, and a number of MEI scholars have done a wonderful job in following the Syrian conflict. Note that there still are a number of other actors in this space. Russia feels confident in its role. We get to the question you raise on construction or reconstruction or rebuilding the country. This is a low priority for Russia. It's great symbolism in terms of rhetoric, but because attention is now elsewhere, resources are devoted elsewhere, and the global economy today is not what it was when the Astana process was initially constructed. My view is that the folks in Moscow realize rebuilding Syria is not going to be an effort that all hands on deck, so to speak, will be there. And so it's really now minimizing that effort. And perhaps if there is a future with rebuilding Syria, it's going to largely come through other actors, be it China, Gulf states, you name it. But in my opinion, Russia is going to play a much, much diminished role in that.
You are attuned and plugged into conflict resolution and various other diplomatic processes around the region. Have you seen a change in the level of involvement of Russian diplomats since the war in Ukraine erupted last year?
It's interesting in this, if you look at high level visits, and if you want to say, photo opportunities, Russia is restarting those. Lavrov and others have done tours in other parts of the world now in this past year. Clearly, as the war began, there were a couple of immediate events, whether meetings with leaders, Pakistani officials or others, individuals coming to Moscow or Russian officials going abroad. We're seeing it move up again, but not to the level it was before the war. I would argue, though, looking ahead, expect to see, and we've seen this now in the last couple of months, expect to see an increase of Russian officials abroad, Russian diplomatic overtures abroad, largely presenting the narrative that Russia is in a defensive struggle against NATO. This is how they're casting their invasion of Ukraine, presenting this narrative to the rest of the world, particularly countries in Africa, South Asia, the Middle East, is going to be a priority for Russia. This Western, what they see as Western blockade or Western aggression against them, they feel can actually be limited by shaping a global narrative about their role in the region. And so I would say diplomatic overtures are going to focus on that, less on solving problems in these specific regions.
And let's turn to another specific case, Iran. Most experts agree that for now, at least, international negotiations on Iran's nuclear program are a non-starter, and Moscow's security and political support to Tehran probably undermine those prospects even more. In the present conditions, it seems pretty unlikely that Russia and the West could cooperate on pressuring or encouraging Iran to agree to a new deal on its nuclear program. But Tehran might be willing to return to the table sometime later this year, especially if its economic situation continues to deteriorate. Would you agree with that? And if so, is there any possibility for the West to structure these talks with Iran in such a way that Russia's ability to play the spoiler is neutralized?
I'm going to go into this question because it's a wonderful question by immediately stating I am not an Iran expert, but when I look at the regime in Tehran and their actions, their statements, obviously regime survival is the priority. Whether we look at the protests, sanctions, you name it, various negative activities that for the Iranian government, ultimately it's about regime survival. And Russia supports that. Russia supports the maintenance of the current regime in Tehran. And so when we think of their objective, first and foremost, that's what it is. Why Russia wants to see Iran become a member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which it's already acceding. Why it looks at a network of states that can break sanctions on Iran, and by the way, sanctions on itself, by engaging with countries, such as China and others. And so when I look at this from the Russian perspective, that's going to be their focus. Getting to the JCPOA, absolutely. The view is this is a dead process, and I think most international observers would probably say this. There might have been a hope a year ago that this could move in a positive direction, but honestly, given the situation, not just within Iran, with the West's engagement with Iran, but also the Russian invasion of Ukraine, this whole process of the agreements on the JCPOA or perhaps having a 2.0 are out. And I would add just a final point within the US, elections coming up, tensions within European countries, attention on an Iranian deal are probably minimal. And so, getting to your question on economic situation, if it were to deteriorate, would this encourage Iran to go back to the table? In light of what I've said about how Russia and other countries are looking at engaging with Iran, and I would argue it's not just in a strategic sense, Iranian drones perhaps helping Russia in its war in Ukraine, but also as an economic quid pro quo, helping Iran connect with a limited global economy to keep it up, to bolster its domestic front, I think is something that would benefit Russia. And this is something that they would continue to support. So I look at these other activities of, I don't want to necessarily say, back channel arrangements that would then develop into full-fledged economic cooperative efforts of Iran, other SCO countries. I don't want to go that far, but I would say that the Russian government, the folks in Moscow, believe that the Iranian regime can remain in power and in fact can turn things around in spite of Western sanctions, US sanctions on it. I'll add one final point on this, and it is sort of a curious commonality. Russia, like the Western states, China as well, do not want to see Iran with nuclear weapons. Nuclear power in Iran is always something Russia feels is their right, but nuclear weapons is something that Moscow has regularly been critical of. Oddly, this was the sort of area of common or agreement, but that's where it stops. And I would say in these other areas, Russia's going to continue to engage with Iran as best it can, and this includes the economic space.
Roger, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
That's all the time we have this week. Thank you to our experts for joining the program, our listeners for tuning in, and to our production team for their work on this week's episode. You can find more expert analysis of the Russo-Ukrainian War and its implications for the MENA region on our website at www.mei.edu. You can also follow MEI on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events. I'm Managing Editor Matthew Czekaj. Please join us again next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.